Cool. So welcome all to Intro to Holochain sessions. Sid today will be hosting. Thank you very much to Sid. And it sounds like we have some other experienced Holochain ecosystem members here. So please chip in where you find it useful. We are so happy to have over 900 applications to DevCamp and really appreciate the community team who's working really hard to put it together. They needed a bit more time, and so we're going to be doing that in September. And in the meantime, we wanted to meet the need for people who really want to just dive into Holochain, get grounded, and then be able to more fully participate in the forum and in other learning events that are happening. So thank you all for coming. You can put questions in the chat or speak up. It looks like we have a small enough group to have a pretty participatory session. And with that, I guess I'll give it to Sid. Oh, also my name is Carolyn. Forgot to introduce myself. My name is Carolyn, I use she, her, and I'll be mostly doing tech stuff today. So Sid, take it away.
Thanks, Carolyn, and thanks for organizing this and sending all the emails and getting us all together in this Zoom room. We have Guillem, who's going to be joining us as well. Guillem, for some of you might have noticed him in the forum. He's built the Holochain Gym, and I think it'll be nice for him to talk about what he's building. Is my audio okay? Yep, cool. So like Carolyn said, today's session is more just an overview. DevCamp's going to be scheduled in September. And so this overview is, I guess we thought of doing one of these sessions because there's a lot of people in and around Holochain who are just looking for I guess like a 60 to 75 minute snapshot on what Holochain is, how it's manifesting in real live applications. And so that could be, we'll focus on that stuff, particularly in the second session through some of the projects that are being built right now. And today's session will be primarily just some of the like absolute basics about Holochain, some of the terms and jargon that are thrown about, which I think if you get your head around, it's really useful to get into conversations, because I'm sure, in some of the threads you've seen on the forum, there's people dropping all of these word bombs like DNA and Zoom, and I think it'll be nice to just get some kind of coherence around it. So today's session will be structured first with a 15 to 20 minute overview of Holochain. It's specifically meant to be an overview, and we won't get into the weeds of things, but hopefully we will have pointed you by the end of this towards enough resources where you can dive in and start getting into stuff yourself. After that, we'll do another 15 minutes on, or 15 to 20 minutes on, what is agent-centricity really? And I think that's a very interesting topic. I'll share my perspective on it, and that's just how I've been unraveling on how agent centricity has been unfolding for me over the last couple of years. I think it might be nice to get a few other voices as well. Matthew's here, who's been part of the project since the early days. We have Guillem as well, who's been associated with a very long time. So it might be nice to hear from them as well. We'll then do a little bit of Q&A, and again, not getting to the weeds, just higher level questions. And then Guillem will jump into or showcase some of what he's building. And Guillem's been building tools for Holochain understanding. So for people who like to get into specifics of how DNAs work, or DHTs, how DHTs store information, like those are really interactive tools that you could be playing with. And personally, I found them really useful. So I requested Guillem to come in and do this. Yeah, so that's what today's session looks like. Thursday's session will be more applications and different projects that are building on Holochain. Yeah, all of these sessions are entirely led by the community. And it's, I think, they're put together broadly from a sense of what we think people want. So at the end of these 2 sessions, we might reach out to you and, if you've got feedback on what worked, what didn't work, or what you might be looking for as a next step before DevCamp begins, I think all of that will be very useful. So maybe we'll think of a nice way to gather some of that feedback. What else? I can't think of anything. Maybe real quick for those who have their video on, or for those who would like to type that into chat, if you could kind of indicate from a scale of 1 to 10 how techy or comfortable you are with tech. I think that'll help us modulate the conversation accordingly. And by that, I mean drop jargon accordingly. So even if you're on chat, just drop some numbers so I can just scroll through and get a sense. 1, if you have never typed on a keyboard, and 10 if you are technically very proficient. And if you've got a camera on, you can just indicate using the camera here. A solid 6, I saw. 3, no coding. 10. Wow, there's some pretty proficient people in here. Okay, thanks. 4, 5, 7, 6, 5. Cool, thanks, that is helpful. And I'll do my best to try and modulate the conversation accordingly. If you think this isn't landing, maybe Carolyn or Matthew or Guillem, if you're in, feel free to unmute yourselves and be like, this is like, if there's any tweaks I need to make. Sound good? Yeah. I will share my screen. Give me a sec. Boom. Is the screen visible? Yeah. Cool. So as the slide suggests, this is an introduction to Holochain or Holo. And we'll first dive into, I guess we're going to dive into Holochain and not so much about Holo, which is the hosting network that is a bridge for Holochain into the more public internet. And so I guess the best way to start is by, just an overall snapshot of how I think about Holochain. And this is after a few years of spending time in the ecosystem. What really lands for me, or what is what's really helpful for me. Sorry, have you lost my screen all of a sudden?
Yeah.
Yep. Cool. Let's just leave it at this. Is to think of Holochain, 1, as a distributed compute fabric, 2, to constantly think membranes as opposed to like universal consensus or some kind of global state or universal truth, and 3, constantly think about, in terms of architecture, think about building blocks. So you're not looking at like building a heavy big stack or any kind of monolithic app that stands by itself, but you're constantly thinking more in almost like Lego-like terms, to put it very crudely. And I put this up right away because I think this contrasts very well with blockchain. And my assumption here is most people have heard about blockchain or have like come into Holo world through some kind of familiarity with blockchain. And so I think this contrasts very interestingly with Holochain, because blockchain is constantly about like building one universal state or consensus almost. And what I found with Holochain is every time I move away from there and constantly think about membranes and building blocks, it just lands so much better. And then that's what I'd nudge all of you as well. Like if you're entrepreneurs or just project builders or just developers, I think using these 3 these 3 points is really helpful. That's been my experience. this slide is a bit intimidating, but I'll break it down. Holochain for me is about, like I said, multiple membranes. So you're not looking at one massive universal network that is held across millions of nodes, but instead you're looking at DHTs or distributed hash tables that are just much smaller, more contextual local groups or networks that hold some kind of record of data. And a word that you'll constantly hear in the Holochain ecosystem is something known as is DNA. And the DNA is best represented as the rules of a game, which basically means if there's a group of people, might be 100 or 5,000 or maybe 5 million people who agree to play a game together or interact with each other or engage with each other in some way, they have to abide by or agree to a certain set of rules that are encoded in what we call the DNA. And there's some parallels with nature, I guess, and some amount of biomimicry in place here, but which is why the term DNA is used, because it represents the rules of a game. So the rules of this game could be, a group of 5,000 people who are part of a blogging network, and this blogging network has decided that each blog can't be more than 1,000 words, and that in its crudest form is an example of a DNA, because no one in that blogging network can post a blog that exceeds 1,000 words. That's just an example, but that's the crudest, best representation of what a DNA is. And so if you're on this within that DNA, within that membrane, or this little micro network that you see, it means that you have to play by the rules of this game. You can choose to tweak the rules of that game, but it means you fork yourself into a new reality, into a new network, and you won't see those 5,000 other people that share that are part of that blogging network. And so it's an interesting pattern, because if you're looking to create some kind of blogging app, you're not looking to have that validated by millions of people on the network like you see in blockchains, but instead these little micro networks are way more contextual and play by rules that are specific to that membrane. So that's broadly what a DNA is. And information within that DNA is shared within a DHT. So each individual user, if you can see my cursor, has a record of information that they post to the network. That record is called a source chain, which basically means if I'm part of this blogging network, I choose to post 5 blogs today, I'll have a record of these 5 blogs in my source chain. And these source chains are follow a little chain of sorts. So it's possible for someone to come in and check if I've followed the rules, if they've been posted in a certain order, and if I tamper with the rules, that chain is broken. And so validity of these, or whether or not I've stuck to the rules, is maintained in this source chain. And so you'll hear the word source chain thrown about as well, but that's basically what it means. Now, apart from this, we do have what's known as sharded DHTs, which is basically every user not only stores their own source chain, but they also have a fragment of some other people's source chains stored at their end, right? And that's the point of a DHT of this sort, because if I'm part of the network, maybe I've posted 5 blogs, and if I were to drop off or switch off my machine, others in my network might still want to access my blogs, but because it's sharded and stored on so many other nodes in the network, that record is available even if I go offline. And so validation is also done at that level, when people can actually check if I follow the rules. And so that's how a DNA or a DHT ensures some amount of validity of data in the network. This, I think, is pretty much like an overall nice snapshot of the way Holochain works. And I think it's a good contrast with blockchain, like I said, because blockchain is much more centralized universal network where everyone's constantly storing a snapshot of all the information that's been processed in the network. Any real quick questions at this point of time? Like real quick. You could just unmute yourself or just drop it in the chat, and maybe I'll try and catch something just to get a sense of where people are at.
Real quick, so just to say it for myself, DHT spelled out stands for
Distributed hash table.
hash table.
Yeah. So it's basically every entry that's like, let's say I've I want to publish a blog. A shard of that gets stored somewhere in this distributed hash table. So when someone else wants to go look for that blog, they just need the hash of that blog, and they can actually piece that together and access it, even if I'm not online. But yeah, that's basically how this all works. So like I mentioned, each user has a record of transactions at, or a record of entries that they've passed. So, thinking about the blogging network, I might have 5 blogs that I've posted. So if you can see my cursor, there's entry 1, entry 2, like these would technically be blogs that I've posted to the network. So I hold a record of these on my user chain, right? And so to break that down even further, let's say there's a network called App1. It's a blogging network called App1. Bob is part of this network. Bob holds a record of all the blogs that they've posted, but they also have a record of entries that A and C and D and E and F and G and other people who are part of the network who have also posted to the network. And so they hold little shards of this information as well. Now, as an app creator or a project developer, you have agency over what kind of redundancy factor you need. So if it's really critical information you're passing, maybe it's some kind of currency, and it's really critical that no one tampers with this data, you might want to have every single entry stored by a larger group of people in this network. But if it's more playful, more resilient, you might want to save costs and be more efficient and maybe have shards stored with a far lesser number of people. And so as an app creator or a project developer, it allows you to play with the way information is validated. And I think that's really interesting because in the blockchain universe, you don't have that freedom. And so if you're trying to create an app, which might be as simple as, sending little claps on other people's blogs or little likes on someone's photos, having a like validated by 1 million people is expensive. And it's almost ridiculous to think that my like on your photo should cost $10 to store, because we're not sure of what bits of information have monetary value. Maybe they do. Maybe my like on your photo is worth, $10, but maybe it's not. And maybe, on an aggregated level, maybe it is. Maybe 10 years later, it might be. And so Holochain allows you to breathe a lot more and actually validate information contextually, which I think is super cool. And I think if you're a developer or a project builder, that was definitely what drew me towards Holochain, and what I even today and continue to enjoy in my design process, because I can play with so many dimensions. And so to people on this call, that's what I would recommend looking out for, because that's, I think, the key facet here. Some more details. We have different kinds of entries. You have private ones, you have public ones, you have encrypted ones. And so within your, going back to the blog post app, you could have blogs posted by people that are public and free for everyone to see. You could have them posted privately. So maybe They're not blogs, but they're, the little private notes that I like to write to myself, and I don't want to share them with anyone. But I also don't want them to be lost if I lose my hard drive. And so you can have a little note taking app which also operates in the DHT, and everyone's privacy is respected. You could have encrypted entries where, maybe I publish blogs, but I just want to share them with people who pay my monthly subscription, or people who I trust deeply, or people who like my photos. I don't know. But encrypted entries let you play with these entries in that way, because you can actually send specific people the key to the entries that you pass. And again, so Holochain allows you to play with these dimensions or levers, and really architect applications that are much more relevant for you. And so the building blocks of most Holochain apps are what you might call DNAs and zones. I've kind of mentioned, I've explained DNAs on this conversation already. DNAs are basically rules of the game. And so a blogging application would be an example of one kind of DNA. A private note storing application would be another DNA. You might have interesting combinations where multiple DNAs make up what is called a HAP bundle. So you might have one larger application that has blogging, photo sharing, note taking, all bundled together within one application. And so multiple DNAs make a bundle. And so I would recommend playing with DNAs because they allow you, each membrane has different rules within the game. So blogs, you could have one DNA for public blogs, one DNA for private blogs. And more importantly, I think DNAs can be used very skillfully for membrane control. Because entry to a DNA could be regulated on the basis of some kind of reputation, some kind of membership that is validated in another network. And so DNAs allow you to say this group of people can have access to this information because they're playing by these rules of the game. And in the most basic level, like that's what a DNA is to me. And for some of you might know this, each DNA is composed of more modules that we call zomes. And so zomes could be considered the tiniest building blocks of Holochain land, or the atoms of this world, as it were. And so there's different. So once you get into the forum, I would really recommend exploring different ways of playing that are emerging. So some people prefer packaging everything into zones. And so when you're building an app, you can actually borrow other zones that have been written, like maybe there's zones related to membership or access or publishing or chatting, and you can actually plug those zones into your DNA. But we're also seeing approaches where people are packaging things into DNAs. And so membership and publishing and chatting could also be packaged as a DNA. And these are just different approaches that are emerging. And so I would actually urge you to get into some of this on the forum, because it allows you to see, like, I think how you architect your app could be a function of how you want to go and how you want to, how you play with zones or DNAs. And so I would actually not share my opinion here, because I think there's a lot of varied approaches which are fun to explore. Another interesting aspect about Holochain apps, and this is what I find really fascinating, is bridging between DNAs. And so let's say Bob is part of an application one, like let's say it's a blogging app, blogging network. App2 is another blogging network, which he shares with another group of people, and App3 is the third blogging network. Because Bob has all three apps running on their node, they can actually bridge between these applications, and that can be very interesting because you can actually relay information from one application to another. It could be reputation data, so you might have situations where blog network 1 says you have access to our network if you're well validated in app 2 and app 3. Like, let's say if you have 500 likes or claps from these people in the other application, you're welcome to join our network. And so Bob can actually access application 1 because he's well validated in other contexts. And so we'll talk about this a little later, but for me this is super exciting because for the first time, I think we have an opportunity to break past some of the silos that applications force upon us. And I think that's the joy of agent-centric technology, because it actually flips these power dynamics on its head, and we can actually bridge information or relay information contextually in a way that's relevant for us between these applications and between these membranes. And I think there's some interesting patterns that emerge from there. But I will leave it at that. I feel like this has been the boring bit of this session. It was a bit technical, but I think it was nice to get into it and get it out of the way, because I think the conversations of the next 20 to 30 minutes might be much more like how this architecture just explained results in certain patterns and certain ways in which we can interact with each other. So yeah, these are some of the links that you can go check out. I would recommend checking out the forum, which is interestingly not put up. Oh, there it is, forum.holochain.org. Like, I think that's one of the best places to find people and get into conversations. And apart from that, there's obviously some of the other links, the AMAs, the social media channels as well. They tend to be more spam-like, so I would really recommend getting into the forum for some more detailed conversations. Should we do some really quick questions on this before we jump into what agent centricity really is and other topics? Any quick questions coming up for people? Cool.
I said,
Sure, good.
yeah,
Hey.
just a quick
Hey,
question.
Makram.
So, you talked about how the data is stored locally on everyone's individual's device, and a person may host a part of others' data as well.
Yep.
And this is all dictated by what the rules are in the DNA, so-called DNA. So, is it possible that a holochain-based app stores data centrally? Just the DNA says that no data will be. I mean, can a holochain app just become like current apps that are
Like a
out there?
current centralized server architecture.
Yes.
Can I ask why you're asking that? Like, why would
because for some applications, maybe people have the size of the data might be large. They don't want to store any data on their own device. So is it possible that it can become like that also? I'm just trying to understand the flexibility of the architecture.
So there are ways to work around that. You could potentially pass these as private entries. So let's say, the large video files that you're recording and storing, like you could pass them as private entries. And so they would be stored on your node. Like maybe that's a Holo host, like a Holo server itself, or maybe it's your own machine. And if you've stored it as a private entry, that doesn't actually get sharded and pushed out to, correct me if I'm wrong, Guillem, it won't get sharded and pushed out to all the other nodes. And so technically you could save on the efficiencies there. And so there's ways to work around. There's a few people working on file storage, and like some of those things are being pieced together. Guillem, you look like you have a point to make. Yep. Go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question, because there are tensions sometimes between what's more efficient to go decentralized, what's more efficient to go centralized, and there's also always the question about resilience, right? So the way that you would design something like this on Holochain is you would have two DNAs. One DNA, you would not put files on the DHT, right? So imagine Twitter, a Twitter clone, for example, millions of people in this open DNA, and you don't put the files there. You have a second DNA, which only the servers, quote unquote, that are always online and that have high bandwidth and storage have installed, and both DNAs can communicate with each other. So if I'm in the Open Twitter app, and I receive a hash of a file, I can go and ask some node of the other DNA to fetch that file for me. So I don't have to host that file in the DHT of the phones or whatever. But there are some n nodes, it might be 1, might be 10, might be 100 of always online nodes that are doing that, are providing the file storage for me.
Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, Macron, you might find some threads on this in the forum. So I would explore, or yeah, even if you don't see it, feel free to just start a thread and you'll see a few people jumping in. I think before we jump into what is agent centricity, since we've done a little technical overview to Holochain, I just thought it might be nice to call in Matthew if he's willing. For those who don't know, Matthew was part of the origins of Holochain, especially during the big public kickoff. Might be nice, Matthew, for you to share in a few minutes, just like what was the point of Holochain, and yeah.
Wow, that's gonna go big.
Or maybe more specifically,
yeah. Where do you want me to take that?
In contrast, let's keep it in contrast to blockchain. Like what, or like what kind of patterns you think it's unlocking?
We were working on this stuff before blockchain came about, before Bitcoin came about. And Holochain came out of something called the Metacurrency Project. The thing that we had been working on prior to Holochain is called Scepter. And we kind of got into a proof of concept place with Scepter. And there was another thing that we needed to build for this thing that we were working on, this like redesign of the internet. And that little piece was basically what has become Holochain. But at that point we realized, wow, this piece is like a small piece of our project, but it's something that the world really needs, which is a way to actually run peer-to-peer applications that are truly peer-to-peer, and to sort of opening up the topic that you'd already mentioned, agent centricity. You know, our philosophy is very different in that, you know, our way of looking at the world is that each participant sees the world from their particular vantage point, right? So some of you might be on a low bandwidth connection, and so you may not see any video right now, right? Like the video is not making it through, or maybe the audio, some of the parts of the audio aren't even making it through, but for somebody else, it's coming through just fine, right? So each of us is actually receiving different bits of information, and we actually have different receptivity. We have different ability to receive different information. So I'm able to hear sound, but if that sound is in Chinese, I don't understand the Chinese. I can hear the sounds, it doesn't translate into meaning for me. Somebody else who hears those same sounds, oh, it's totally meaningful, and they're able to do things with that. For us, our perception on this stuff is that basically the way the world actually works is not, there's central like control things that puppeteer everything else, and this is where it's all stored, and there's a single like vantage point. Nope. There are many different vantage points, and they're dancing together. And the primary advantage that comes out of that diversity of perspective is an improved adaptive capacity for that community, that ecology, that ecosystem. Because participants can try things, and if it works, great, they can keep doing it. And if it doesn't work, it cost them some time, some effort, some energy, whatever the resources were that they used, but it didn't cost everybody. So the cost of trying stuff and failing is actually really low community-wide, which means the community is able to try things, and it's able to try things at all different scales, at the individual scale, at a group of 2 or 3 scale, at groups of groups scale, across the entire thing, right? Every different layer of complexity can have different amounts of experimentation and building upon past learnings going on. So there's this low cost of failure, but when people figure out something that works, like in the Holochain world, hey, we found this app that we like, like we tried that 1,000-word blog app and it's working for us. Like it keeps people from getting too long-winded, it enforces some kind of discipline, but it's longer than, the tiny stuff that you can cover in Twitter. We love it, right? Cool. A bunch of us start using that thing, and it propagates. Does it propagate so that everybody who uses Holochain has to run that app? No. Does everybody have to store that material? No. Does everybody have to pay attention to that stuff? Do they have to have it land on their device? No. Just the people who want to make use of it. And once it goes beyond that, when I tell my friend about it and they're like, I hate reading and I hate writing. And so they're like, no thanks. It doesn't propagate beyond that. So discoveries, innovations, new inventions, they propagate in an agent-centric system. They propagate just beyond where they prove useful, and they don't go further than that. So you have this like relevant propagation of useful stuff and a really constrained cost, a really constrained propagation of the cost. So the benefits go wide, the costs stay constrained. So that community is able to try things and adapt and evolve far more readily than any organization or community that's making use of some centralized system for sense making. And I think I'll leave it there. I have no idea if I just threw everybody for a loop or if that's actually helpful. So
I would like to
I
add
think it was
something here, if I
perfect.
may.
Yeah, please go ahead, Moritz.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think what Matt is explaining is some of the philosophy behind Holochain that allowed the team that built Holochain to make architectural choices in the design of it that then allow the people who use this technology, Holochain, for building their apps to make much more intentional choices about how they want to build things and have a very different landscape in front of them of what costs they have to pay for the things they want to get out of this and what benefits they get out of it for those costs. And so when you look at the blockchain landscape as compared to Holochain, the landscape there looks very different. You have a lot of choices that you have in Holochain you don't have at all in the blockchain space, because for example, you can't choose how many nodes something propagates to in most blockchain apps, because it by default propagates to all nodes, because that's just the architecture of blockchain. And in Holochain, you have that choice. And by making that architecture so different, you then get the benefits of having to pay so much lower costs for many of these choices. And that then allows you to, pay less for hosting, or to build an app that is online even when most of the nodes are offline. Those kind of things become possible because of those choices that have come out of the philosophy that Matt just outlined.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks, Matthew. Thanks, Moritz. I think what you all shared was perfect, because I hope it grounds what I shared up front into more, what you can do with some of this technology. So we've got a couple things. There's a few slides that continue and kind of borrow from what Matthew and Moritz shared. So maybe we'll jump into that real quick for, I would say, 5 to 10 minutes. And then we have Guillem, who's going to take us through the Holochain Gym. Guillem, how much time would you like for the Holochain Gym? 15 minutes?
Yeah, or like we can do whatever in the range from short to long. 10-15 minutes
Stop being
is
modest.
Well, it depends also on what you need. So yeah, 10-15 minutes.
So maybe
would
10
be
to 15
good.
minutes. We've got like 75 minutes budgeted for today's session. So yeah, maybe 15 minutes.
Perfect.
I think the next bit can be kind of short because I feel like it's kind of adjacent to what Matthew and Moritz were saying. Is my screen visible?
Yes.
Yeah. I think agent centricity is a pretty like a large term that is still being unraveled by most of us. Some might also say it's not really agent centricity. It's not agent centric. It's collaboration centric. Like that's a new conversation that's emerging within Holochain. Honestly, I don't know. I think there's different perspectives on this, and so I would actually urge you to form your own take on this stuff. And you can see a bunch of content within the ecosystem. Like there's a whole lot of YouTube videos. There's some interesting posts by Medium posts by Eric as well on this topic around collaboration centric. So I think all I'll do is just add on to some of the perspectives Matthew and Moritz shared, um, with the intention of sparking that curiosity in you all, and urge you to form your own philosophy around what's really happening here. But for me, the three big points that stood out were contextuality, modularity, and bridging. And contextuality relates to what Moritz said, because you're not pushing information or not validating information in a massive network. You're moving from consensus to contextual validation, and that's really relevant for people like us. Like I'm part of an organization that's building reputation infrastructure, and so simple things like passing reputation currencies, or something like a like or a clap or an upvote or downvote, that is valuable to say 5,000 people or 100,000 people, can't be recorded on a blockchain because it costs so much. But in our little holochain network, in our own DNA, in our own DHT, it's a fraction of that cost, like maybe fractions of cents. And all of a sudden, it allows us to start recording a much broader spectrum of information. So it's not just the monetarily critical, but also the contextually relevant. And so I think that's pretty wild because it's allowing for new kinds of information to be stored, and that means new kinds of interactions can be forged on the basis of this information. And to me, that's really interesting. And so I would say contextuality was the first shift for me. The next another one was what we're calling modularity, because DNAs and zobes are so composable and slot perfectly into each other. You're seeing some interesting patterns emerge over the last year or so. That's so it's almost like a little branch of Holochain is very attracted to this concept called modularity, where you're not building, like, I think when we think of an app, we tend to think of it as like a large monolithic stack that stands by itself. And that application runs everything from your identity layer to your reputation layer to your content to your intelligence, which guides people within the app. But because Holochain allows that composability, you might say, oh, someone's built a really good in identity layer, I'm going to borrow from them. Someone else has built like a fantastic layer for monetary currencies, I'm going to borrow from them. And so I think I would frame, I'm bringing up the slide because I think it aids interactions within the ecosystem. And this has been my experience within Holochain. I found a lot of value in diving in and looking laterally. And I found there's a lot of things that we don't have to build when building an app, because there's probably so many others who are thinking about it, grappling with it, and have actually built like a perfectly composable module that you can incorporate into your design. And so I think stacks are getting really slim and they run on shared infrastructure. So I would say like skills in a way might also be moving away from like building monolithic stacks to stitching things together with shared infrastructure, which is I think an interesting pattern, and I think it suits a few people, a certain kind of people. And I brought it up because I would say like when you get into the forum, start thinking in that way, because you'll find a lot of benefit from it. And that brings me to the third point, which is bridging. I find Agentcentricity really unleashes the power of bridging, which means because validated information is stored at the agent's end, it's really easy for that information to bleed into other membranes. So if I'm running a node and if I'm part of, I don't know, 10 different apps, I hold agency over how information flows across these applications. And that is pretty wild, again, because I think in centralized architectures, it's really hard for information to flow from one app to another. Like try porting your Facebook information into other apps, and I think most people know that's pretty impossible. But I think Agentcentricity unlocks that because an individual can actually port their context across communities. And so that means engagement, what we're finding is engagement isn't as driven by some form of artificial intelligence that the app creates and is trying to curate your feed or curate your experience, but instead you drive your engagement in these apps because you're porting your reputational data or your context with you. So maybe what you've done in 1,000 other blog communities guides who you bump into in this community, and those kinds of patterns start getting unlocked. So I think it shifts this emphasis from very centralized AI to distributed webs of social intelligence. And I think that unlocks new ways of discovering people, unlocks new ways of interacting with each other, and also creates feedback loops for, I guess, preventing not so nice behavior on the internet, that where we've almost never really solved that problem, because there's little contextual feedback loops that guide our interactions in Holochain. So I'll kind of leave it at that. So Guillem has enough time to dive into the gym, but some of the meta shifts that we're seeing, you could be seeing a shift from like very global markets to bazaars where commerce is actually embedded in membranes and in social fabric for some of the entrepreneurs out there. Like I think this is a very interesting pattern emerging within Holochain, because I think blockchain, while like crypto is so focused on like frictionless commerce across the world, I think Holochain might be unlocking like more contextual commerce. Like I'm part of these 15 communities and maybe there's like limes in my backyard and I'd love to offer them to these communities in different ways. Like maybe for some communities offer it as a gift, maybe for others it's at some kind of discount, maybe for others it's at market price. And so it's allowing, I would say, new kinds of commercial interactions even. And yeah, I think there's also a much larger conversation there about neighborhoods as opposed to apps, but I will leave it at that. Was my screen being shared?
Yeah, I think.
Oh, okay. I thought it wasn't. Any quick comments or questions before we jump into Guillem? Cool. I don't see any in the chat. I don't know where my chat window is. So there it is. Yeah, so I'll hand it over to Guillem. Guillem has been, I would say, one of the most committed. I'm going to go out and make a sweeping statement and say one of the most committed members in the community. And by that, I mean like one of the most helpful and in tune with what's going on with the community. And it's just been a real joy to be working alongside him and exploring Holochain with him over the last 12 to 18 months. And he is going to show us some stuff that he's been building.
Oh my God, Sid, how do you want me to continue? Like, well, thanks so much for your comments. No, this has been an amazingly fun experience. I don't want to just get into it. Thanks a lot, Sid, for all that you do as well. Like this, just for everyone to know, this is a community that once you get into it, it's so welcoming, and so like you can feel the relationships and the good vibes, and like it's wonderful. Anyway, that was your fault, Sid. Yeah, like you made my heart a bit tender, so I put that on you. That's okay though. Okay, so yeah, without more weird things, I'm just going to talk a bit about the Holochain Gym, which I think its purpose is a bit twofold. First, it's a way for you to experiment at a low cost with the way that Holochain works and so on. And then as a developer, you have kind of a tutorial, step-by-step tutorial that you can follow if you want to get into app development. Right now, what I want to do is just give you a brief taste of what it's there. Also driving home some of the concepts that are really important in Holochain as far as how it works technically, but I don't want to go too technical either. This is not meant to be only for developers, although if you are a developer, this is a good rabbit hole to get into. Okay, so here in the gym, you have interactive representations of what Holochain is and does, right? So this is a Holochain DHT, for example, and you can see every node. You can see my screen well, right? Or should I make it a bit bigger? Or is it okay right now? I think it's okay, yeah. So every node here, you can see it has a name. So as Sid was talking about, every user has its own node running. And if you, like, this is interactive, if you click on it and you can like create entries and play a bit with it, right, and see how things are happening, and there are things, yeah, popping up, validation, and so on. I will get into it a bit later, but just so you have an idea, this is a cool way to just go into it, and there are concepts explained, and then you can play around with the simulation to see how the concepts actually apply to the things, right? Okay, so let's go, for example, to the DNA and so on, and I'm going to stop a bit there. So as Sid said, DNA is basically the rules of a game, right? There are other important things happening in the DNA, like the DNA, you can think of it as the application code, but the most important part of the DNA are the validation rules. And as Sid, I don't know if you said that, Sid, but the ID of the DNA is the hash of the code, right? And every DHT is attached to a DNA. So for example, here, you have a DHT of 4 people, right, that are playing by this rule. So this game has a function. If you call the get, it returns the get of the hash. If you call create entry, right, and you can play with this and actually create entries and so on. Okay, what happens if now Janet goes inside the DNA and says, no, these rules actually are not fitting perfectly well for me. So I just want to change. I don't want to have a get function. I want get my awesome. Oops, just deleted that. Why did I didn't understand that. Okay, get my awesome. Yeah, okay, backspace deletes. Sorry about that. Get my awesome stuff, right? So I'm editing the DNA, right? And when I hit compile, that DNA code that gets hashed, the hash is different. So we are automatically in a different network. And if you see here, it's very small, but now only one node exists in the network, right? And there are two DNAs, so two networks. If I switch back, Janet is actually playing in both networks, in both DNAs, right? So Janet is here playing with these other people. And if I switch to the new DNA we just created, Janet is alone. No one has is playing by the same rules. So no one is communicating with Janet in this DNA, right? I'm just trying to make things clear with these interactions so that you don't actually have to listen to the stuff and believe it. You can go ahead and play a bit with it and try to experiment and fail with those experimentations and learn a bit about them. Next, I want to show like the most important thing in Holochain, I think, which are the validation rules with this call. Like, I love this animation. So she talked about this briefly. So the validation rules are basically functions that say whether a piece of data is valid in the context of this DNA or not, right? So here we have a DNA, right? A DHT with 10 people. And we have Susie. If you look closely, Susie, it has a little demon icon. So Susie is trying to be bad, right? The rules of this DNA is that anyone can create posts, but only the creator of the post can update it, right? So I create a post and Sid can create a post, but Sid cannot update my post, right? So very simple rules of the game. These are the kinds of mechanisms and things that you have to think about when designing Holochain app. Okay, so who can create entries, who can edit those entries, who can delete, who can create links, and so on, right? Okay, so let's try to see what happens when one Sophie, who is an honest agent, creates an entry, and Susie tries to update Sophie's post, right? So just going to click run, okay, and I'm going to do this step by step, so we are a bit more slower, and I can explain. So Sophie has just created the entry and is in the process of publishing it, okay, to the DHT so that other people can receive it and can hold that entry, right? So let's make that happen. On receiving of that publish, right? So Florinda, Darlene, Ava, I'm not sure, receive that publish and they validate that entry, right? So, okay, I'm receiving the post, I'm validating the post came from Sophie. Sophie can create posts, so perfectly fine. We are going to hold that entry, right? Okay. Now, Florinda, right? Let's say that Florinda tries it and makes a mistake and so on. It tries to update the entry. As Florinda is an honest node, it will be running the code of the DNA, and the code of the DNA will tell right away, no, Florinda, you cannot do that. Don't make yourself look like a fool on this DHT. So this is, you can imagine a UI calling the backend here of Florinda and the backend rejecting that update before even publishing anything. Right, but now, okay, so there is an error, nothing is published. Now Susie is the one trying to update. So Susie is a bad agent. Susie has changed the DNA that she is running to one DNA that anyone can update anything, right? So you have no way of controlling or even knowing what code is running in Susie's computer, right? So Susie can do whatever they want, and you don't have a way to really verify that they are running by the same rules, right? So actually Susie calls update entry and is trying to update Sophie's entry. And actually it works. So in Susie's local, you see this is a representation of the source chain, the local chain that every agent has. So Susie actually can create this update, right? Because she has tweaked and changed and cheated in their DNA, and she can update their own source chain. But now let's see. Okay, so Susie publishes that update, right? So Susie's trying to make it through so that everyone believes that Sophie's post is updated. So let's see, it publishes, and now the other nodes are validating it. And since all the agents share the same rules, because we agreed on the same rules before entering, now I know for a fact that Susie is cheating, because Susie has agreed to play by the same rules that we all play in this game, and the rules said that nobody can update any other agent's entry, right? So they validate it, they see it's invalid, and now they start to publish these warrants, right? And a warrant is basically a proof of cheating, right? So now, since everything is signed, we have a countersigned proof from Susie that Susie tried to cheat. And the only thing that we have to do is make that available and publish that around the network. So now you will see a lot of warrants, like a lot of them being passed around saying, alarm, alarm, Susie's trying to cheat. Look at this update.
Real
this
quick,
update.
Guillem,
Yeah.
there's about 4 or 5 people who've asked this question. Well, if Susie just changes the rules, won't she fork into her own network? How can she pass this entry?
Right. If she hasn't forked Holochain's core source code, that's true. Susie will fork herself into her own network. But there is no guarantee that they are using a forked version of Holochain core. And you have no way of actually verifying the code that Susie is running in his own machine, right? So if Susie does 2 things, which is cheat on the DNA, like change the rules of the DNA, and then fork Holochain itself and say, no, I know you're running by a different DNA, but just cheat and lie to everyone about which DNA you are running. So I'm here pretending I'm running this code, but actually I'm running this other one. And you don't control these computers. You have no way of knowing whether that's the case or not until you receive the bad entry. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, so just to clarify, Susie would have forked Holochain itself in order to do that. Yeah, that's
exactly. An honest agent cannot cheat ever, right? So if you try to do this with the Holochain source code as is, you will be forked into your own network. But there is no guarantee that people won't try to cheat with that code as well.
Cool.
So yeah, just real quick, a lot of warrants are being passed by, and every time that someone received a warrant for Susie, they don't want to talk to Susie anymore. So I know you're cheating, I don't want to talk to you anymore because you will try to cheat. So at the end of the day, what happens is that Susie gets ostracized. And you see, okay, we can just go, right? So Susie is left alone into her own mini network, if you want. Like, it's not even a network because she's only playing by herself. So now you have a network that has resiliency towards bad attacks, and Susie, it's like, can be running whatever code she wants in his own computer. Very, very quickly, I'm going to do the same exact rules, but now we have 10 nodes and 6 are bad nodes, right? So 4 good, 6 bad. And just let's see what happens. The bad nodes will try to convince the honest nodes that update was cool, right? That they so exactly the same process. Greta this time is trying to cheat, and the bad nodes will try to convince the honest nodes that that was not cheating, that was correct, right? So at first, I'm going to speed it up a bit. So that's the creation. And now Greta, okay, Greta tries to update. The update succeeds, publishes. Some of the nodes will say it's valid. Some of the nodes will say it's not valid. Warrants from the honest nodes are being sent. And now you see the honest nodes only are connected with each other. So now we have six bad nodes that have been separated into their own network, and the 4 good nodes are only the only ones that keep talking to each other. These honest nodes have been able to do that because everyone had agreed to play by the same rules before entering the DNA, and that's the important key point about data integrity in Holochain is about that. So Cassandra can try to convince me of anything she wants, but ETA knows the rules of the game and knows that what Greta is trying to do does not abide by the rules, no matter what Cassandra tries to tell ETA, right? So if Cassandra tells ETA, no, this update is valid, ETA knows actually Cassandra is trying to lie to me, right? So I can not only not talk anymore to Greta, which is the one trying to do the cheating, but all the other ones that are trying to help the cheater, right? So this is the basic security mechanism in Holochain, and well, it's based in biomimicry as well. So it's called a bit the immune system. When you hear about the immune system in Holochain, this is what we are talking about. Do I have like 3 minutes more, Sid, to go over membranes, or would be better to do questions? What do you think? You're muted, Sid. I don't know if you're talking.
Sorry. So I'd say go for the membranes, like in the
Okay.
3 minutes. There's a bunch of questions. But let's do membranes and then see how much time we've got left.
Okay. So now we have we know what validation rules are. There are one special type of validation rules which are called the membrane rules, right? Which are what agent is allowed to enter this network. And this is really important. This is what makes Holochain so flexible as well. So if one type of the rules of the game is who can play the game, now you can have as closed or as open networks as you want, right? So if I want to do a chat app, I can say one of the rules of the game is that the creator of the chat has invited the agent. Right? If that's one of the rules of the game, you can have privately and decentralized networks, which is like really, really cool. And you can have many different networks with different membranes. So maybe you want to have a private chat only with the members of your family, but then you want to have a neighborhood chat, and that's not going to be as tight as the family members, right? So maybe you have some kind of social triangulation, or maybe even some password, something like this. For example, here we have an open network, right? Everyone can join this network, but then I can go ahead and clone this private chat DNA, right? And say, okay, UID is like UUID. Like if you're a bit technical, you know about this. If not, I don't care about it too much. And then this membrane proof is what you can use to figure out whether that agent is allowed to go into the network or not. So in this case, it's a password and it's super secret code, right? If I know the password, I can clone the DNA and create a new network. Now I'm still playing by the other one, right? So Ro, he's both in the open one and in the smaller one. And now let's say that Alta wants to do exactly the same. So she wants to join the same chat application that Ro has created. So she does the same, execute. Oh no, what was the UUID? I missed that. Okay, so let's do the same here. So again, the ID of the DNA is the hash. So if you change just a letter, it changes, right? So, okay. So now both alt and row have cloned the same DNA. So they have exactly the same code with the same hash. And as you can see, you have now a network of 2 nodes. And you can imagine the flexibility, people cloning DNAs, people having smaller membranes, bigger membranes, and how you can begin to think about what the design of a Holochain application can look like. Okay, that's everything I wanted to cover as of now. Yeah.
So there's, thank you. There's a bunch of questions. I don't know if we should get into it because I think everyone is really excited by some of the examples you shared.
Mm-hmm.
So I think people are imagining more situations or ways in which they could hack this. I'm wondering, Carolyn, what do you think? Could we just make a thread on the forum out of it? Because I'm not sure Guillem will be around for the next session on Thursday. So we may not have time to go into those answers then, unless you want to, Guillem.
You mean answer the questions now or in next session?
No, like we're just trying to figure out answer next session, or should we do it on the forum?
I'm okay to do next session.
Okay.
I think
Why
so.
don't we start next session for like 5 or 10 minutes with this then?
Awesome. Yeah. Looks good. That sounds good.
Let's do that. In fact, why don't we create some kind of system? Can we create some kind of system? Or if you've got any more questions, just pop them into the chat and then we can take them next session.
Yeah, so there will be a video of the session and I'll post it to the forum. I would say collect questions if you have them between now and Thursday on that forum thread. We can try to get to some via text and then
so
we'll
just to
go
clarify,
into
you'll create a new forum thread for this?
Yeah, I'll
Is that
create
right,
a forum thread
Carla?
and post this video.
Cool.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, that's great. Just real quick, Guillem, can you repeat how people can access the Holochain Gym and play around?
Sure, just putting it in the chat right now. So it's holochain-gym.github.io. And I just showed the concept section, which is going around how Holochain works internally. Just really quick, I can share, if you go to developers, here is a step-by-step tutorial. Okay, so some functions, what are some functions, and then you have code and exercise. Creating entries the same. So you have here a step-by-step guide of the concepts bit by bit with code exercise at the end. I think this is a really good resource to start developing.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And I think with that, we're going to wrap today's session right on time. Anything else, Carolyn? Any reminders?
Great.
Real quick. Yeah, so next time we'll try and recap some of the questions that came up real quick, and then we'll jump into some of the projects that are building on Holochain. So we're hoping to feature Kizuna, Holochain, Neighborhoods, Junto maybe, yeah, a bunch of them. And yeah, so the next session might be more application specific. And yeah, that's all.
Great. Thank you so much, Sid, Guillem,
Cool.
Matt, Moritz.
Thank you all. Yeah, thanks, Matt. Thanks, Moritz. Thanks, Guillem.
All
Thanks,
for
everyone.
coming. This was great.
Yeah, thank you too. Thank you too.
Bye.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all. Carolyn, Sid, Guillem.
Thank you. Bye all.
Thank you. Thank you.
You guys, thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks. Cheers. Bye bye.
Thank you.